The playground of St. Catherine's Academy was a sea of navy blazers and expensive laughter, a place where the air smelled of honey lavender floor wax and the safety of generational wealth. But Annie Whitmore wasn't playing. She was crouched by the roots of the ancient oak tree, her fingers trembling as she pressed her phone to her ear. "Daddy, she's there again." Today makes 3 days. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Jonathan Whitmore, a man who could crash markets with a text message, went deathly still in his glass-walled office 60 floors above the city. He didn't ask who or where. He knew. For 2 days, his daughter, his only heartbeat in a world of numbers, had whispered about a shadow at the gate. He had dismissed it as a child's imagination. Now, that dismissal felt like a lead weight in his chest. "Annie," he said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory calm. "Is it the same woman? The one with the pink doll?" "Yes," Annie whispered. Her eyes locked on the iron bars of the perimeter fence. "She hasn't blinked. She's just looking. Like she's waiting for me to say something." Across the street, standing on the public sidewalk just outside the school's jurisdiction, was the woman. She wore a brown coat that had seen too many winters and a floral scarf tied tightly over her hair. In her arms, she cradled an old, matted pink doll with a missing button eye. She didn't look like a kidnapper. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like a ghost that had finally found the house it was haunting. "Don't move," Jonathan commanded, the sound of his heavy chair scraping against marble echoing through the phone. "I am sending Graham. He is 2 blocks away. Stay behind the tree. Do not let her see your face again." "Too late, Daddy," Annie's voice cracked. "She's looking at me now, and she's crying." The invisible threat hook had snapped shut. In the world of high-stakes security, a man with a gun is a problem you can solve. But a woman with a doll and a silent, weeping gaze is a mystery that bypasses every firewall. Within minutes, the polished routine of the school shattered. Mrs. Palmer, the homeroom teacher, approached with a clipboard, her smile fading into a mask of confusion as she looked from Annie's terrified face to the woman at the fence. "Mr. Whitmore?" Mrs. Palmer said, taking the phone from Annie. "There is a woman here. She's been here every morning, now that I think about it. I assumed she was a nanny. She's just standing there." "You assumed?" Jonathan's voice was a blade. "My daughter has been under surveillance for 72 hours, and your assumption is all that stood between her and a stranger? Get her inside, now." As Annie was led away, she looked back one last time. The woman at the fence didn't reach out. She didn't scream. She simply clutched the doll tighter and took one slow, deliberate step toward the gate, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a name. The mystery wasn't just who the woman was, but what she knew. Jonathan Whitmore had spent millions to keep Annie's past a buried secret. But as he watched the live security feed from his car, he realized that some secrets don't stay buried. They walk up to the gates of your life, hold a pink doll, and wait for the truth to come out. The sun at St. Catherine's Academy didn't just shine, it gleamed. It caught the gold leaf lettering on the Academy's stone pillars and reflected off the polished hoods of the idling SUVs in the drop-off lane. Everything here was designed to signal a specific kind of peace, the expensive, curated peace that only the world's elite can buy for their children. The playground was a masterpiece of safety. The rubberized flooring was thick enough to bounce a falling toddler back to their feet. The air was filled with the sounds of orderly joy, the rhythmic thud-thud of a leather soccer ball, and the polite chirping of children in tailored navy and gold uniforms. This was a fortress of privilege, a place where the outside world's messiness was filtered out by high iron gates and 24-hour thermal security. But standing just inches beyond those iron bars was the glitch in the system. The woman in the brown coat was a jagged tear in the school's perfect canvas. She didn't belong in a world of lemon-scented hallways and organic snack packs. Her coat was heavy with the dust of the city, and her scarf was a faded, frayed thing that fluttered in the wind like a distress signal. While the school moved in a blur of expensive activity, she was a terrifying point of stillness. Annie stood in the center of the playground, the blueberry muffin scent from a classmate's breakfast still lingering in the air. To anyone else, it was a beautiful Tuesday. But to Annie, the contrast was suffocating. Every time she looked at the woman, the safety of the academy felt like a lie. The thick iron bars, meant to keep people out, now felt like the bars of a cage that kept Annie trapped in the woman's line of sight. The woman held a pink doll. It was a cheap thing, the kind you find in a bin at a grocery store, and its presence was the most invasive part of the scene. In a school where children played with high-tech tablets and precision-engineered toys, that raggedy, button-eyed doll looked like a relic from a nightmare. It wasn't just a toy. It was a message. "She's still there," Annie whispered into her phone, her back to the oak tree. The bark felt rough and real, the only thing grounding her, while the world around her felt like a stage play. Behind her, she heard the safety of the school continuing. A teacher blew a whistle, a crisp, authoritative sound. "Line up, everyone! Hands to yourselves!" The normalcy was agonizing. How could the teachers be worrying about hands to yourselves when there was a woman at the gate who seemed to be reaching out with her eyes alone? The juxtaposition was a physical weight. The school was a sanctuary of wealth, yet it couldn't stop a single penniless woman from haunting its most precious occupant. The more the sun highlighted the beautiful brickwork of the academy, the darker the woman's shadow seemed to grow. She was a silent reminder that walls, no matter how expensive, are only as strong as the secrets they try to hide. When Annie finally looked up and met the woman's eyes, the safety of St. Catherine's evaporated. The expensive uniforms and the secure perimeter didn't matter. There was only the girl, the woman, and the pink doll that looked exactly like the one Annie had lost in a fire 6 years ago, a fire her father told her no one else had survived. The elite academy was no longer a fortress. It was a glass house, and the woman outside had just picked up a stone. The playground was a frantic hum of movement. But for Annie Whitmore, the world had slowed to the rhythm of a single heartbeat. From behind the thick trunk of the oak tree, she didn't see a predator. She didn't see a monster waiting to snatch her from the gates of St. Catherine's Academy. Instead, through the black iron bars of the fence, she saw a woman who looked like she was breaking apart in slow motion. "Daddy," Annie whispered into the phone, her voice thick with a strange, heavy realization. She's not trying to open the gate. She looks like she's hurting. Jonathan Whitmore's voice was sharp with the frantic energy of a man ready to go to war. "It doesn't matter how she looks, Annie. People use sadness as a mask. I've seen men cry while they steal millions. Stay back." But Annie was 6, and her heart hadn't yet learned the cold cynicism of a billionaire. She watched the woman's face through the gaps in the iron. The woman's eyes weren't scanning the perimeter for security guards or looking for a weak point in the lock. They were fixed entirely on Annie, shimmering with a layer of unshed tears that caught the morning light. It wasn't the gaze of a hunter. It was the gaze of a person watching a sunset they thought they would never see again. The woman clutched the pink doll to her chest. Not like a prop, but like a life preserver. Her knuckles were dark and cracked from the cold, pressing the matted fur of the toy against her worn brown coat. She took a breath, and Annie saw her shoulders tremble. It was a deep, shuddering sob that the woman swallowed back, her jaw tightening as she fought to stay composed. When their eyes finally met, Annie felt a jolt that wasn't fear. It was recognition. The woman didn't wave. She didn't beckon Annie to come closer, with the fake, high-pitched sweetness of a stranger trying to lure a child. She simply stood there, her face a map of exhaustion and grief, looking at Annie with an expression that said, "I remember you." "She's crying, Daddy," Annie said softly, ignoring her father's command to hide. "She's not scary. She's just wet-eyed, like when I lost my favorite book and thought it was gone forever." This was the emotional trap. A villain is easy to hate. A grieving mother is impossible to look away from. The curiosity gap widened with every second the woman remained silent. If she wanted to hurt Annie, why hadn't she moved? If she was a stranger, why was she holding a doll that looked like it had been pulled from the ashes of a house fire? Mrs. Palmer, the teacher, finally reached the fence. She had approached with the stern authority of a woman used to dismissing solicitors. But as she got closer, her pace slowed. She saw what Annie saw. The woman at the gate wasn't an intruder. She was a tragedy in a brown coat. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Palmer called out, her voice losing its edge. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't answer. She simply looked at the teacher, then back at Annie, and whispered a single word that didn't reach the ears of the staff, but seemed to vibrate through the iron bars and settle in Annie's bones. It wasn't a threat. It was a name Annie hadn't been called since she was an infant in a different city, in a different life. The woman turned then, her movements slow and heavy, and began to walk away toward the bus stop. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She left behind a playground full of security guards and expensive cameras, but she took the peace of the Whitmore family with her. The mystery was no longer about a kidnapping. It was about a debt that was 7 years overdue. Jonathan Whitmore did not live in the same world as other people. In his world, a second was a currency, and a mistake was a sin. As he sat in the back of the Blacktown car, the city of New York didn't look like a collection of buildings. It looked like a grid he was currently dominating. 7 minutes, Jonathan said, not looking at his watch, but at the digital clock on his dashboard that synced with global servers. "I want the school's private network mirrored to my tablet in 60 seconds. If the headmistress hesitates, tell her I own the debt on the academy's new gymnasium. She'll find her spirit of cooperation quickly." Graham, his head of security, nodded into his earpiece. This was the power dynamic in its purest form. Jonathan Whitmore didn't ask for permission. He moved through life with the easy certainty of a man who bent time to fit his needs. While the rest of the world waited for the police or filed reports, Jonathan deployed private units and bypassed bureaucracy before the sun had even cleared the skyscrapers. But then, there was Mrs. Palmer. When Jonathan finally stepped into the hallowed, lemon-scented halls of St. Catherine's Academy, the air tension shifted. Mrs. Palmer stood there, clutching a clipboard like a shield, her face a mask of well-meaning negligence. To her, the woman at the fence was a disturbance or a misunderstanding. To Jonathan, she was a security breach that should have been neutralized 48 hours ago. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sure there's a simple explanation," Mrs. Palmer began, her voice carrying that soft, patronizing tone teachers used to de-escalate upset parents. "She didn't actually do anything. She was just standing." "She was standing in the same coordinate for 3 days," Jonathan interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating chord of cold fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The power in the room had already shifted toward him, making the teacher look small and disorganized. "In my world, Mrs. Palmer, nothing is a pattern, and a pattern is an intent. You saw a woman with a doll. I saw a threat assessing my daughter's routine. You didn't think to call me because you were waiting for her to act. I don't pay this school to wait for a tragedy. I pay you to prevent it." The contrast was brutal. Mrs. Palmer represented the slow, reactive world of procedure and assumptions. Jonathan represented the fast, proactive world of absolute control. He turned away from her before she could offer another excuse, dismissing her presence entirely. He walked into the headmistress's office, and even Evelyn Porter, a woman who dealt with senators and CEOs daily, stood up instinctively. "The footage," Jonathan demanded. As he watched the grainy screen, his eyes weren't looking for a face. They were looking for a motive. He analyzed the woman's posture, the way she gripped the pink doll, and the specific timing of her arrivals. While the school staff stood around, whispering about how sad the woman looked, Jonathan was calculating the distance from the fence to the nearest exit and the speed of the M15 bus she had boarded. "She's not a stranger," Jonathan muttered, his hand hovering over the screen. "What do you mean, sir?" Graham asked. She knew exactly when recess started. She knew which tree Annie hides behind. She didn't come to explore, she came to visit. He looked back at the headmistress and Mrs. Palmer. They were still stuck in the what if and the maybe. They were civilian spectators in a high-stakes war they didn't even know was being fought. Jonathan Whitmore, however, was already 3 moves ahead. He wasn't just looking for a woman in a brown coat anymore. He was looking for a ghost from a past he had paid millions to bury. The tone was set. The school provided the stage, but Jonathan Whitmore was the director. The pacing didn't slow down for apologies or tea. It moved at the speed of a man who knew that in the next 60 minutes, his entire life could be undone by a woman holding a raggedy pink doll. The atmosphere in the headmistress's office was cold, clinical, and heavy with the scent of old paper. Jonathan Whitmore sat behind the mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the digital image of the woman at the fence. To the school staff, she was a security threat. To his security team, she was a target. But as Jonathan zoomed in on the pink doll she cradled, the high-stakes thriller of the morning suddenly collapsed into something far more devastating. The doll was scorched. One side of its plush face was darkened by an old, deep-set soot that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Jonathan's hand began to shake, a physical betrayal he hadn't experienced in a decade. He remembered that doll. He remembered it lying on a sidewalk 7 years ago, surrounded by the charred remains of a low-income apartment complex in a neighborhood. The world chose to forget. He had been there as a young philanthropist, looking for a way to build his image, but he had left with a child. "Sir?" Graham's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "We've tracked the woman's transit card. She's living in a shelter in Queens. Name is Sarah Jenkins. Records say she was the sole victim of a residential fire 7 years ago. Pronounced dead at the scene, but apparently it was a clerical error. She was in a coma for 2 years, unidentified." The room went silent. The motherhood twist had arrived, turning the cinematic chase into a gut-wrenching drama. Jonathan looked at Annie, who was sitting quietly in the corner, coloring a picture of the very oak tree where the woman had watched her. Jonathan had told everyone, including Annie, that she was an orphan of a tragic accident, that her biological parents were gone. He had given her a life of silk sheets, private jets, and ironclad security. He had bought her safety, but he had built it on a foundation of a beautiful lie. He thought the fire had consumed the truth. He didn't realize the truth had survived. Spent 2 years in a hospital bed, and 5 more years searching every playground in the city for a face she remembered from a dream. "She's not here to take her," Jonathan whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She's here because she's been looking for her heartbeat for 7 years. The pink doll wasn't a weapon or a prop. It was the only thing Sarah Jenkins had managed to pull from the flames. It was the twin to the one Annie had in her toy chest at home. The one Jonathan had replaced to quiet the baby's cries in those first few months. The genre of the morning had shifted entirely. This was no longer about a billionaire protecting his asset. It was about the raw, undeniable pull of a mother who had clawed her way back from the dead. The viewer wasn't waiting for a gunshot anymore. They were waiting for the moment a mother's arms finally closed around the daughter she thought was ashes. "Daddy?" Annie looked up, her dark eyes searching his. "Is the lady okay?" Jonathan looked at his daughter. The girl he had raised. The girl he loved more than his own life. And then he looked at the screen at the woman who had actually given that life to her. His power, his billions, and his time-bending influence were useless here. "Graham," Jonathan said, his voice cracking, "cancel the police report and get the car ready. We aren't going home." "Where are we going, sir?" Jonathan stood up, his eyes blurred with tears. "We're going to the bus stop in Midtown. It's time Annie met someone who has been waiting a very long time to say hello." The script ended not with the chase, but with a question that would haunt every viewer. Can a father's love compete with a mother's miracle?